The first thing people got wrong was the word outbreak. Outbreak sounds like a headline that happens somewhere else. A map with a red dot. A press conference. A clean timeline. What it actually felt like, here in southeastern Pennsylvania, was a slow, ugly misfire in the normal world. Like the whole region was a machine that had always hummed along. Traffic lights, delivery roads, hospital shifts, school drop-offs. And one part started stuttering. Not stopping. Stuttering. And because it didn't stop all at once, we all tried to keep moving with it. I was on a roof in King of Prussia the first morning I realized the stutter wasn't going to correct itself. My job title at the time was Building Controls Technician, which is a boring way of saying I spent my days getting big commercial buildings to behave. Heating, ventilation, and air conditioning equipment. Variable speed drives, air handlers, dampers, sensors, alarms, schedules. The invisible choreography that makes an office feel normal. That morning, the office park was normal enough that I could hear the Pennsylvania Turnpike in the distance and the faint, constant sigh of rooftop units cycling. And if you ignored the texts in my pocket, it could have been any Tuesday. But I couldn't ignore them. ER is slammed. Do not go into the city. Have you seen the videos? I had an old friend from trade school, Tanya, who'd become a nurse at a hospital down in Norristown. She didn't do dramatic. She didn't do exaggeration. She did triage, medication scans, vital signs, and the kind of calm that comes from being needed. Her messages came clipped and tense. I looked across the roof at the fresh air intake hoods and the exhaust fans and thought about how much of civilization was just controlled airflow. Make the air clean. Move it where people are. Keep it comfortable. Keep it quiet. Keep it safe. Below me, cars moved through the office park like nothing had changed. I finished my call-out because muscle memory is powerful. I replaced a bad sensor, reseated a wiring terminal that had vibrated loose, verified the readings on my handheld meter, and watched the rooftop unit settle into a stable supply temperature. All the while my phone kept vibrating. When I climbed down the ladder and walked past the glass doors of the office building, the receptionist was wiping down the counter again. She gave me a smile like we were all participating in a little ritual of reassurance. On the drive home, I passed a grocery store with a line outside that wrapped past the cart return. People stood too close together, talking in urgent little bursts, staring at their screens. The line didn't look like panic. Not yet. It looked like everyone had collectively decided they were going to take just in case seriously. By the time I hit the Schuylkill Expressway, and the skyline of Philadelphia showed itself in the hazy distance, I saw something else. Emergency vehicles, more than usual, but not in a neat convoy. A scatter. An irregular pattern, like a system that was losing the ability to coordinate. I did what I always did when something felt wrong. I went home, shut the door, and started making lists. My apartment was a one-bedroom in Conshohocken, 3rd floor. A good place when your biggest threat is rent increases and your biggest inconvenience is a neighbor practicing drums at 8 o'clock at night. Not a good place when your threat is people, and your plan involves not being found. The videos made it easy to imagine the danger, but they didn't tell you what to do. People in the videos moved wrong. That was the first detail that made my stomach tighten. Not dramatic, not theatrical. Wrong. Like their bodies were running on corrupted instructions, like the human software had glitched. On social media, the arguments started immediately, Is it drugs? Is it a hoax? Is it a new illness? Is it a foreign attack? Is it mass hysteria? Is it edited? Then the live streams started dropping mid-sentence. Then the official channels started saying things like, avoid unnecessary travel, and stay calm, and limited incidents. At 3:14 in the afternoon, Tanya called. When I answered, I heard background noise before I heard her voice. Not the usual controlled hospital sounds, not the gentle beep-beep of monitors. It was louder, sharper. Human voices layered on top of each other, too many of them. "Tanya," I said, "talk to me." "I can't," she said, and her voice did something I'd never heard it do. It wavered. "I can't stay here." "Where are you?" "Norristown. I'm in a supply room. They're moving people into the hallway. It's not working. We don't have—" Her breath hitched. Something banged. A metal sound. "Tanya, listen," I said, forcing calm into my tone like I was adjusting a set point on a thermostat. "Are you hurt?" "No." "Can you leave the building?" A pause. I heard her swallow. "There's security at the doors. They're trying to keep people from—" She stopped, lowered her voice. "Some people are not themselves." I didn't ask her to describe it. I didn't want the images in my head. I wanted a plan. "Can you get to the back loading area?" I asked. "Staff exits?" "I think so." "Do it," I said. "Don't go alone. Find someone you trust." "I don't know who I trust right now." That sentence did something to me. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was the realization that the social rules had broken. That trust, which had always been a background assumption, was now an active risk calculation. "Tanya," I said, "I'm going to tell you where I'm going. If you can get out, you come there. If you can't, you go anywhere that keeps you out of crowds." "Where?" she whispered. And that's when I said something that would shape the next months of my life. I'm going to disappear. I could have tried to make a run for family, but my family wasn't close. My dad had moved south years ago. My mom was gone. I had cousins, but not the kind you show up at unannounced with an emergency and a vague warning about infected people. I could have tried to join the crowds heading west or north, but crowds were the problem. Every video, every news clip, every story was the same pattern. People clustered, people trapped, people desperate. I was a building systems guy. My instinct wasn't to flee blindly. My instinct was to find a space I understood, a space I could control. And I knew something most people didn't pay attention to. Under the edges of this region, the highways, the interchanges, the office parks, the shopping centers, there were service corridors, stormwater structures, utility easements, access shafts, retention basins, culverts that ran under roads like veins, little unloved pieces of infrastructure that kept the world from flooding, and that nobody looked at unless something went wrong. If you wanted to be invisible, you didn't build a cabin with smoke rising. You didn't light a generator that growled. You didn't hang sheets in a window and hope no one noticed. You went where people never looked in the first place. I threw a backpack on the bed and started filling it with the stuff I already owned. Water bottles, a headlamp, a spare battery pack, a small first aid kit, work gloves, a multi-tool, 2 lighters, a rain jacket, warm socks. Then I got more deliberate. From my closet I pulled my tool bag, my real one, the heavy canvas bag with the reinforced bottom. Inside were things that weren't just useful, they were leverage. A good set of screwdrivers, a compact socket set, adjustable wrenches, wire cutters, a small hammer, a tape measure, electrical tape, zip ties, a battery-powered drill with 2 batteries, and a handful of bits. I grabbed my handheld meter and extra test leads. If I was going to use any electricity I found, I needed to know what I was touching. Then I opened my kitchen cabinets and my brain did what it always did. Inventory, calories and shelf life, peanut butter, oatmeal, a few cans of beans, pasta, salt, instant coffee, a jar of honey. Not enough. I didn't want to go to the grocery store line. I didn't want to get pulled into a wave of human behavior I couldn't steer. But I needed supplies, and I needed them fast before stutter became collapse. I drove to a smaller place, a corner store tucked behind a gas station near a strip of warehouses. The kind of store most people forgot existed unless their tank was low late at night. Inside, the shelves were already thinning. Someone had taken most of the bottled water. Someone had cleaned out the cheap batteries. The cashier looked exhausted, eyes red like he hadn't slept. I bought what I could without drawing attention. More water, canned food, a bag of rice, a few protein bars, a box of plain crackers, a couple of large trash bags, and a cheap plastic tarp. As I carried the bags to the car, I heard shouting from the road. A car had stopped at a weird angle, half in the lane, and a man was leaning out of the window yelling at someone I couldn't see. Then I saw movement near the sidewalk. Fast, uncoordinated, like a person sprinting but not aiming. The runner crashed into a mailbox, bounced, and kept going. People turned their heads. Nobody moved toward it. That, more than anything, told me the stutter was spreading. People were learning, instinctively, that approaching was dangerous. I got in my car, locked the doors, and drove. The location I had in mind wasn't a secret bunker with a movie-style steel door. It was something I'd noticed months earlier on a job. A stormwater maintenance access near a highway interchange, close enough to civilization for resources, far enough from foot traffic that nobody wandered there for fun. There's a section near the edge of Valley Forge National Historical Park where the landscape shifts. Wooded slopes, drainage channels, old stone. Mixed in with that are modern solutions. Concrete boxes and grates and riprap that guide water away from roads. On a rainy day, you don't think about it. You're just grateful the road isn't flooding. But those structures exist, and because they exist, they have access points. The specific one I'd noticed was a rectangular concrete vault hidden behind a line of brush and a low berm. On paper, it was probably labeled with a boring code. In real life, it was just a metal hatch flush with the ground, surrounded by weeds. The only reason I'd seen it was because my work sometimes put me in the weird in-between spaces, behind buildings, along fences, near utility corridors. I parked a half-mile away, in a spot that didn't look suspicious, and walked with my backpack and tool bag. I avoided the main path, cut through low woods, listened for voices. The air had that late summer heaviness, like the humidity was holding on. When I found the hatch, it looked exactly like I remembered. Dull metal, a handle recessed in the center, a few leaves stuck to it. No sign anyone had been there recently. I knelt, brushed away debris, and tried the handle. Locked. Of course it was. But stormwater structures aren't bank vaults. The locks are meant to keep curious people out, not to stop someone with tools and time. I didn't want to make noise. Noise carried. Noise invited. So I didn't force it. I studied it. The lock was a simple puck-style padlock, the kind used on outdoor utility enclosures. Not impossible. But I didn't have the right key, and I wasn't going to turn this into a loud problem. Instead, I walked the perimeter. Most of these systems have more than one access point, an inlet and an outlet, sometimes a laddered maintenance shaft. I followed the slope down toward a drainage channel lined with stones. I could hear water moving faintly, leftover flow from earlier rain. And there it was, a concrete opening set into the hillside, half hidden by brush. A culvert mouth large enough for a person to crawl through. The water at the bottom was shallow, a thin ribbon, and the walls were stained with years of use. I crouched and shined my headlamp into the darkness. The beam caught something reflective a few yards in. A metal ladder bolted to the wall leading up. That made sense. The hatch above likely opened into the vault, and the culvert was a lower entry point where water came through. The culvert wasn't locked. It wasn't meant to be. I didn't go in right away. I sat in the brush and watched for 10 minutes, then 20, listening for footsteps, for voices, for the subtle sound of someone else moving. Nothing. I put on my work gloves, tightened my backpack straps, and crawled into the concrete throat of the drainage system. The temperature dropped immediately. The air smelled like wet stone and earth. My headlamp beam bounced off rough concrete. I moved carefully, keeping my knees out of the shallow stream, using the dry ledge on the side when I could. The sound of my movement seemed too loud in the enclosed space. After about 30 feet, I reached the ladder. It was corroded but solid. I tested it with my weight, then climbed. Above me, I felt for the underside of the hatch. It was a metal plate with reinforcing ribs. I could see light through thin gaps. I didn't open it. Not yet. First, I needed to know what I'd be opening into. I climbed the last rung and pressed my ear to the metal. Silence. I pushed gently. It shifted maybe a quarter inch, then stopped, held by the lock mechanism. So the hatch was locked from above, but the vault itself, if it existed, was accessible from below. That meant I could occupy the space beneath it without ever opening it, at least initially. I climbed down 2 rungs to a point where I could stand on the ladder comfortably, and I examined the wall. There, to the side, was a concrete bench, like a shelf, wide enough for a person to sit. Above it, the vault expanded into a boxy chamber. The ladder rose through an opening, and around it the chamber had dry space, out of the direct water flow. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't safe in a fire. It wasn't a home. But it was hidden. And hidden was the new definition of safe. I climbed into the chamber, set my tool bag down, and turned off my headlamp for a moment. In the darkness, I listened. The world above was a faint murmur. Distant traffic. Wind in leaves. Nothing that screamed immediate danger. I turned the headlamp back on and began the first stage of my shelter plan. Make the space livable without making it noticeable. The problem with hiding underground isn't just the entrance. It's everything else you produce. Light, heat, sound, smell, waste, patterns. Most people think invisibility means camouflage. It doesn't. It means reducing signals. Light is a signal. Even a tiny glow can travel through cracks. Sound is a signal. Metal clinks. Footsteps. Coughing. Tools. Smell is a signal. Cooking smells, a body odor, garbage. Heat is a signal too. Not just comfort heat, but the thermal signature that rises and vents through soil and grates, visible to anyone with equipment, or sometimes even just felt as warm air on a cold day. I didn't have fancy equipment. I had tools and a brain trained to think in systems. so I started with what I could control. I spread the tarp on the concrete bench to create a cleanish surface. I used trash bags as a moisture barrier along the edges where water seeped. I used zip ties and electrical tape to secure the tarp in place without banging anything. Then I mapped the chamber with my tape measure. Rough dimensions, height, width, where the air moved. Air movement mattered. Stagnant air meant condensation, which meant mold and discomfort. Too much airflow meant smells could travel. There was a small vent line, a pipe, maybe 4 inches in diameter, running along the wall. Likely a conduit for something or an overflow. It had gaps where air seeped. I held my hand near it and felt a faint draft. That was my first clue. The system breathed. Not a lot, but enough that I wouldn't suffocate sitting in there overnight. Still, I wasn't going to gamble my life on faint draft. I took out my handheld meter and checked the battery. It wasn't an air quality meter, but it was a habit. Check what you can check. Then I did something I'd never thought I'd do in a stormwater vault. I made a test candle. I didn't have an actual candle, but I had a lighter and a small piece of paper. I tore a strip, twisted it, and lit it briefly, watching the flame. The flame leaned slightly toward the pipe. Air was moving from the chamber toward that draft. Good. It meant any smells I made inside would tend to drift that way, toward whatever vent above. That could be bad if someone was nearby outside. But it also meant I could manage airflow direction with simple barriers. Create zones. Keep the sleeping area downwind of waste. I built a tiny partition with the tarp and some duct tape for my tool bag. Not a wall, just a hanging flap to guide air and give me a psychological sense of, this is my corner. Then I sat on the bench and did the second thing that mattered in any emergency. I waited and watched the world change. It changed faster than I expected. That first night, I stayed in the chamber with my headlamp off most of the time, only flicking it on for quick tasks. I ate crackers and peanut butter, drank water in small sips, and tried to sleep sitting up because I didn't trust the damp concrete yet. Above me, sometime after midnight, there was shouting. Not close enough to understand words, but close enough that my body tensed like a wire pulled tight. Then running, footsteps pounding, a car horn that wouldn't stop. Then, later, silence. When dawn came, it wasn't a sunrise I saw. It was light filtering down through cracks, turning the concrete seams into pale lines. I checked my phone. No service. That didn't mean the networks were down completely. Underground, reception was always weak. But it was another stutter. Another piece of normal failing. I moved with care up the culvert toward the opening, keeping low. I peeked out through the brush. The sky was clear. The air smelled like late summer and exhaust. Somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed, then cut off. On the highway, traffic was lighter than usual. A few cars moved fast, like people trying to get somewhere before they were stopped. I saw no one on the nearby path. I slipped out, stayed in the shadow of the brush, and made my first decision as a person who had chosen invisibility. I would not go back to my apartment. If I went back, I'd have to carry supplies through public spaces. I'd be seen. I'd be known. And if things got worse, a third-floor apartment could become a trap. My apartment also had one fatal flaw: windows, light leaks, noise, a pattern of living. A hidden shelter, even an uncomfortable one, had one huge advantage. Nobody expected a person to be there. But to make it viable, I needed real supplies. Not just food, I needed a power plan, a sanitation plan, a water plan, a heat plan for colder nights, and most of all, I needed a way to come and go without becoming obvious. So I built routines that reduced signals. I moved only at times when the world was naturally loud: early morning rush noise, midday highway roar, rainstorms. I avoided quiet nights. I kept my clothing neutral. No bright colors, no reflective surfaces. I taped over shiny parts of my backpack buckles. I chose paths that weren't paths: utility corridors, tree lines, the backside of berms, places where you could disappear 10 feet from a sidewalk. On the second day, I found what I needed in a place people weren't thinking about yet: a commercial building maintenance area. Near the office park where I'd been working, there were dumpsters behind buildings. There were loading docks. There were utility rooms. There were storage cages. Most of them were locked, but not all. People panic by water and food. They don't panic by rolls of insulation or spare air filters. They don't grab boxes of nitrile gloves from a janitorial closet unless someone tells them to. I did. I slipped into the back area of a building early in the morning when the lot was empty. I used my work badge out of habit, then realized the doors didn't even require it. Someone had propped a service door open with a rock. Inside, the hallway smelled like carpet and cleaning solution. Normal. Hauntingly normal. I moved like I belonged there, because I had belonged in places like this for years. I found the maintenance closet and opened it. Inside were supplies that suddenly felt like treasure. Contractor trash bags, paper towels, disinfectant wipes, a box of disposable masks, a case of bottled water meant for employees, a small toolkit that wasn't as good as mine but had spare items, and, best of all, 2 new high-efficiency air filters for a rooftop unit. Thick, pleated filters, the kind designed to catch fine particles. I didn't know if the infected situation was airborne. Most signs pointed to direct contact, but I wasn't going to assume anything. Air control was my whole world. I took the filters. I also took something that solved one of the hardest problems of invisibility: smell. A box of activated carbon filter pads, the kind used in some air purifiers. Not perfect, but useful. I loaded what I could into a duffel bag I found in the closet, then left without triggering any alarms. The building's security system might have still been active, but it was designed to detect forced entry. A door propped open didn't count. When I got back to the culvert entrance, I paused, listening. No voices, no footsteps. I crawled in, hauled the duffel down, and started upgrading my chamber. I wedged one of the high-efficiency filters near the draft pipe, not blocking it, but creating a path where air had to pass through it. I used duct tape carefully, pressed, not slapped, so it wouldn't peel. Then I layered a carbon pad behind it. It wasn't a real ventilation system, it was a partial solution. But partial solutions stack. That's how survival works. I created a sanitation corner using 2 contractor bags nested inside each other in a small plastic bin I found in the closet. Waste is one of those things people ignore in movies until it becomes a crisis. Underground, it becomes a crisis quickly. I made rules, strict ones. Waste sealed immediately, stored downwind, moved out during rain or when highway noise masked my movement. Next, power. If I stayed hidden, I couldn't run a generator. The sound would travel through the ground and out the culvert like a megaphone. The smell would leak. The vibration would be a beacon. So I needed silent power, battery power. At first, I used what I had, a couple of portable battery packs meant for phones. But that was like trying to live on teaspoons of water. I needed something more. The third day, I took a calculated risk and went to a big box home improvement store. Not through the front. Through the garden center fence where, in normal times, employees stepped out to smoke. The parking lot was chaotic. Cars parked crooked, shopping carts scattered. A couple of people moved fast, pushing loaded carts. There were no orderly lines anymore, just clusters and tension. I stayed at the edge, in the tree line, watching. This is where invisibility wasn't about hiding behind a bush. It was about not behaving like a target. People looked for threats and opportunities. Someone moving with purpose, alone, carrying something valuable. That drew eyes. So I waited for a distraction. It came in the form of a loud argument near the entrance. Two men shouting over a cart. People gathering to watch like conflict was entertainment even in a breakdown. While eyes turned, I slipped along the fence, found the gap, and went in. Inside the garden center, the air smelled like soil and fertilizer. The lights were still on, but dimmer in the back. I moved toward the indoor section, keeping to the side aisles. I didn't take anything flashy. I took practicality. A roll of reflective insulation. The thin kind used behind radiators and in attics, not because I planned to insulate my shelter like a house, but because reflective barriers can manage heat signatures. If I could keep my body heat from bleeding upward, I'd be harder to detect and I'd be more comfortable in winter. I took a small, basic solar panel kit, one of the portable ones meant for camping with a charge controller. Solar wasn't perfect in a wooded area, but I didn't need huge power. I needed trickle charging. I took a deep cycle battery, the kind used for marine applications. Heavy, but it was silent energy storage. I didn't take a giant one. I took a mid-sized one I could physically move. I took a small direct current to alternating current power inverter, because some things need household-style power. And I took spare fuses. I took a pack of low-voltage light strips, warm white, dimmable, because bright light is a signal, but controlled light is sanity. I took a manual water pump kit meant for rain barrels. That wasn't for pumping underground, it was for transferring water quietly. And I took a bundle of paracord, because rope solves problems you don't know you have yet. I kept everything in a flat cart, moved slowly, like I was just another person doing supplies. My heart hammered the whole time. At the back, I saw a store employee sitting on the floor near a closed door, head in his hands. He looked up as I passed, eyes glassy. "Is it true?" he asked. I didn't know what question he meant. That was the problem. Too many truths now. "I don't know," I said, and it was the most honest thing I'd said all week. He swallowed. "They're saying don't go home." "Home is wherever you can control," I said, then realized how strange that sounded to someone who wasn't trained to think like me. I didn't stop. I didn't offer a grand plan. I wasn't a leader. I was a technician trying to become a ghost. At the exit, I waited again for noise, for distraction, then pushed the cart through the garden fence gap and into the tree line. Moving the battery was the hardest part. It was awkward and heavy, and every rustle of leaves sounded like an alarm. I used the paracord to make a sling, dragged it over soft ground instead of lifting, keeping the weight low. It took me nearly an hour to move everything the half-mile to my hiding spot. By the time I crawled into the culvert with the battery, my arms were shaking. Inside the chamber, I set the battery down on a piece of foam I'd scavenged earlier to reduce vibration and keep it away from damp concrete. I wrapped the reflective insulation along the upper wall and ceiling of the chamber where it mattered most, between my living space and the soil above. I didn't seal it completely, airflow mattered, but I created a thermal layer. Then I connected the solar charge controller and ran the cable up the ladder. I didn't open the hatch. I didn't want to risk the lock noise, and I didn't want to be seen from above. Instead, I fed the cable through the seam where the hatch met the frame, carefully, gently, so it exited into the brush line without creating a visible gap. Then, outside, I positioned the solar panel flat on the ground in a patch of sunlight and covered it with a loose layer of camouflage, a thin mesh I'd taken from the garden center and scattered leaves on top. It reduced efficiency, but it reduced visibility. Invisibility always costs performance. That became my motto. Inside, when the controller light blinked to indicate charging, I felt something I hadn't felt since Tanya's call. Control. I wasn't safe. Not truly, but I was no longer just waiting for the world to decide my fate. I was shaping a small pocket of reality inside concrete and dirt. That night, I allowed myself a dim light strip, set to the lowest level. The warm glow turned the chamber from a hole into a room, and in that soft light, I made the first real plan. A shelter that didn't just hide me, but made me uninteresting. Because hiding isn't only about not being seen, it's about not being worth finding. I organized my supplies into zones. Food in sealed containers. Tools hung on makeshift hooks made from bent wire. Water stored low and stable. I created a sleeping platform using the tarp, foam, and cardboard. Off the concrete. Moisture is invisible danger. It saps heat and breeds problems. I taped over any shiny surfaces that could reflect my light out through cracks. I made a sound policy. No metal on metal. Every tool laid down on cloth. Every movement deliberate. Then, in the early hours, I heard something again above the hatch. Footsteps. Slow. Not running. Not panicked. I killed the light immediately and sat still, my breathing shallow. The footsteps stopped directly above me. For a moment, nothing happened. No voices, no banging. Then I heard the subtle scrape of something being dragged, and the footsteps moved away. I waited 10 minutes, then 20, then 40, before I let myself breathe normally. In that silence, I realized a brutal truth. I wasn't the only one thinking about hiding. The world above was learning, adapting, shifting into new behaviors. Some people would become loud, some would become predatory, some would become invisible too. My shelter wasn't just protection from the infected. It was protection from the living. The next few days blurred into a rhythm of careful movement and information hunger. I couldn't rely on my phone, so I scavenged a small battery-powered radio from another maintenance closet. I found it in an office break room, still in its packaging, probably part of an emergency kit no one had ever opened. At night, deep underground, I tuned it slowly, listening to static and fragments. Some stations were gone, some were still broadcasting, but the messages were repetitive, automated, or clearly outdated. A loop. A recorded announcement. But occasionally, in the gaps, I heard live voices, strained, tired. They talked about curfews that nobody could enforce, about shelter-in-place orders that sounded like wishes, about incidents spreading along major corridors. And then, one night, I heard something that made me sit up. A call sign. Not a government station, not a commercial broadcaster, a ham radio operator, an amateur radio voice, reading messages for people who didn't have other channels. I wasn't licensed. I'd never gotten into the hobby, but I knew enough to recognize it. The voice was calm, methodical, using clear language and repeating key details. He mentioned a temporary aid point in a school gym in Phoenixville. He mentioned road closures near Norristown. He mentioned that the state police were advising people to avoid highways. And then he said something that made my chest tighten. Reports from Montgomery County Hospital are inconsistent. Staff evacuation ongoing. That was Tanya's hospital. I listened until the battery died. The next morning, I made a choice that went against my rule of invisibility. I went looking for Tanya. I did it carefully. I didn't go straight to the hospital. That would be a magnet. Instead, I moved toward the outskirts of Norristown, sticking to service roads and tree lines, watching from distance. The closer I got, the quieter it felt. Not peaceful quiet, empty quiet. The roads weren't filled with abandoned cars like in movies. They were just less used. Cars were still there, but fewer. The system hadn't crashed into a wall, it had drained out. Near a small intersection, I saw a group of people standing outside a pharmacy. The windows were broken, not shattered in a dramatic way, just broken enough to get in. They moved in and out with bags, not running, but tense. I didn't approach. I didn't want to be pulled into a conversation, or worse, into an argument. I slipped around behind the buildings and kept moving. When I reached a ridge where I could see the hospital in the distance, I stopped. There were vehicles in the lot, but not as many as a normal day. A few ambulances sat at odd angles. The main entrance area looked crowded in a strange way. Shadows, movement, but not the orderly flow of a functioning facility. And there were no sirens. No steady stream of arriving help. Just a building that looked like it was holding its breath. I didn't go closer. I couldn't. Because a person approaching a hospital right now was either desperate or dangerous. Either way, they would be seen, questioned, and possibly blocked. So I did the only thing I could do without becoming obvious. I left a message where Tanya might find it if she was alive and moving. There was a pedestrian underpass not far from one of the hospital's back roads, a place people use to avoid crossing traffic. Concrete walls, dim light, a corner where notices and flyers sometimes stuck. I wrote with a marker I'd stolen from an office supply closet. Tanya, I'm safe, I'm near Valley Forge, stay out of crowds, look for the old drainage line by the highway, wait for rain to move. M. I hesitated before adding the last part. It felt like a dangerous detail. But Tanya knew how I thought. She knew I'd pick infrastructure. She'd figure it out. I stepped back, looked at the message, and felt the weight of what I'd done. I'd left a breadcrumb. Breadcrumbs can be followed by anyone. So I added one more line. Smaller. If you see this and you're not Tanya, keep moving. It was pointless, maybe, but it made me feel like I'd tried. On my way back, the sky turned gray and heavy. A storm rolled in. Rain is a gift when you're trying to be invisible. It creates noise. It washes away scent. It changes patterns. But rain is also a threat in a drainage system. That was the trade. When the first drops hit, I was already moving faster, wanting to get back before the real downpour. Water level in culverts can rise quickly. You don't negotiate with physics. I reached the culvert entrance as the rain intensified, and I crawled in, the sound of water pounding the concrete amplifying like drums. Inside, the shallow stream I'd been stepping around was already swelling. I moved with urgency, careful not to slip, then climbed the ladder into the chamber. Within minutes, I watched the water level rise in the lower channel, the flow becoming more aggressive. The chamber stayed dry, just barely. Water lapped at the threshold but didn't breach. I sat in the darkness, listening to the roar, and realized my hidden shelter had one enemy more reliable than any infected person: water. So the next upgrade wasn't comfort. It was safety. Over the next week, between storms, I reinforced the chamber's relationship with water. I built a small raised barrier using sandbags I scavenged from a construction site along a highway ramp. Not full sandbags. They were heavy. I filled them partially, enough to create a low berm. I lined the base with gravel and plastic sheeting to direct seepage away. I created a go bag that stayed packed at all times: essentials, radio, water, tools, and a small portion of food. If the chamber flooded, I needed to leave fast. I marked the walls with a simple water gauge, lines scratched into the concrete at different heights, so I could see at a glance if water levels were trending upward after rainfall. This wasn't paranoia. It was engineering. Every system has failure modes. You survive by identifying them and building contingencies. During that same week, the region above me shifted further. The soundscape changed. Less commuter traffic, more occasional bursts of speed, single cars moving fast. More sirens at night, but fewer than before. Some nights, none at all. I started to smell smoke sometimes, faint and distant, carried by wind. Not necessarily a disaster. People burn things all the time. But in a world where municipal services were struggling, smoke meant unpredictability. I also started seeing signs that other people were adapting. On the third scavenging run after the storm, I found a neighborhood street where several houses had towels stuffed under doors, windows covered, silent. Someone had placed a handwritten sign on a stop sign: "Quiet area, do not honk." That sign told me there were still communities trying to preserve normal rules, trying to build new agreements. But agreements only work if everyone participates. 2 blocks later, I saw a different sign sprayed on plywood: "Take what you want." That one was an admission of defeat. I avoided both. I kept moving like a shadow, collecting only what I needed from the margins. One afternoon, I came back from a run with a small prize: a compact carbon monoxide detector from a hardware store shelf. Battery-powered, designed for houses. I placed it in my chamber and tested it. It beeped. Worked. I didn't plan on using combustion underground, but the detector wasn't for a scenario I planned. It was for a scenario that might happen anyway: a leak, a mistake, an unexpected need. Invisibility isn't only about avoiding others, it's about avoiding your own errors. That night, while I sorted supplies, I heard the radio crackle again. The ham operator's voice was back, weaker this time. He read a list of locations where people had left messages: community boards, shelters, aid points. Then he paused, and his voice tightened. "And, to the nurse called Tanya, message received. Repeat, message received." My hands stopped moving. The radio hissed. He continued: "Your friend is near Valley Forge. He says stay out of crowds, move with weather, look for drainage line near highway." He exhaled audibly, like he knew he was reading something risky. "Tanya, if you can hear this, respond if possible. Keep it short. Use your judgment." My heart hammered. I hadn't sent anything to a radio operator. I hadn't transmitted. So how had he gotten that message? Then I realized my underpass note. Someone had seen it. Someone had relayed it. Maybe Tanya. Maybe someone else. It meant one thing either way. My breadcrumb had entered the world. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the dark, listening to the smallest sounds, imagining strangers following the idea of drainage line near highway like it was a treasure map. At dawn, I made a new rule. No more public messages. If Tanya came, she'd need to find me without me advertising it. So I changed the approach. Instead of leaving clues, I created a recognition system, something only Tanya would understand if she got close. Near the culvert entrance, deep in the brush, I tied a strip of orange electrical tape, just a small piece, around a low branch. Then I covered it with leaves so it wasn't obvious from the path. Orange tape had been a joke between us in trade school. She'd always borrowed mine and never returned it. If she saw it, she'd know. If someone else saw it, it would look like construction debris. That was what invisibility became. Signals designed for one person and meaningless to everyone else. The first time Tanya came, I didn't see her. I heard her. A soft scraping sound inside the culvert. Not the chaotic noise of someone stumbling, controlled movement. I froze, light off, sitting on my sleeping platform, listening. The scraping stopped. Silence. Then a whisper, barely audible, drifting through the concrete. Orange tape thief. For a second, I didn't trust it. My mind flashed through possibilities. Trick? Trap? Coincidence? Then she said my name the way she always did. Flat, slightly annoyed, like she was scolding me for existing. Mason. I stood slowly, keeping my headlamp off, and moved to the ladder opening. Tanya, I whispered back. Her silhouette appeared in the lower channel, headlamp dimmed and pointed down. She looked smaller than I remembered, shoulders hunched, hair tied back tight. Her scrubs were gone. She wore a hoodie and jeans and a backpack that looked too heavy for her. You actually did it, she breathed, half disbelief, half relief. I did, I said. Get up here. She climbed the ladder carefully, then stepped into the chamber. The moment she saw the space, tarp walls, dim light strips, organized supplies, her face changed. Not joy, not comfort, something like exhausted respect. Of course you made it a mechanical room, she said, voice rough. I made it breathable, I said. She let out a laugh that turned into a cough. Then her knees buckled slightly, and I caught her arm. Easy, I said. I'm fine. She lied automatically, the nurse reflex. I guided her to the sleeping platform and handed her water. She drank in small, disciplined sips, like she'd been rationing. How bad is it? I asked. She stared at the tarp wall like she was seeing through it. It's not one thing, she said. It's everything. It's the way people switch. The way they stop responding like themselves. The way the hospital turned into a funnel. She swallowed. We tried to keep order, she continued. We tried to triage. We tried to isolate. But when the first staff member changed, it broke the trust. When security tried to control exits, people pushed. When people pushed, others got hurt. When others got hurt, the not themselves people moved faster. She didn't say anything graphic. She didn't have to. Her eyes were enough. I left, she said quietly. I left when I realized the building was going to become a trap. I found an older janitor who knew the back corridors. He got me out through a service stairwell. He didn't come with me. She pressed her lips together. I kept moving, she said. I slept in a church basement. Then I found your note. Then I heard the radio. Then I regretted hearing the radio. That was my fault, I said. It wasn't, she said sharply, then softened. It was human. You wanted to be found by one person. The world doesn't work that way anymore. We sat in silence, the concrete around us humming faintly with the distant world. Then Tanya looked at my supplies. You have a plan, she said. I have systems, I replied. A plan implies I know what the world will do next. She nodded, like that was the truest sentence she'd heard in days. The first week with Tanya was harder than the first week alone. Not because she was difficult, because two people produce more signals, more breath, more smell, more movement, more waste, more heat. And because two people have to negotiate space, and negotiation creates noise, spoken noise, emotional noise, friction. But Tanya brought something I didn't have, medical sense and human sense. Where I saw airflow and drainage, she saw infection risk and stress fractures in the mind. You can't just hide, she told me on the third day. You need to stay stable. Stable is hidden, I said. Hidden isn't stable if you spiral, she countered. You need routine, not just concealment. So we built routines. Morning, check water level marks. Check the solar controller. Check the radio. Eat something simple. Stretch joints. Inventory supplies. Midday, one person rests while the other does quiet tasks, organizing, cleaning, reinforcing tape seams, checking for leaks. Afternoon, if movement was necessary, it happened during highway noise or rain. Only one person went at a time, unless it was a high-risk run requiring a second set of eyes. Evening, dim light only. Radio check. Quiet conversation. Then darkness. We treated the shelter like a controlled environment, because that's what it was. We also improved the invisibility. Tanya had a strong sense of smell, more than mine, and she noticed something immediately. Cooking smells will travel, she said. I'm not cooking, I replied. Not down here. You will eventually, she said. If you don't, you'll become weak. She was right. So we compromised. We didn't cook underground unless we absolutely had to. When we did, we used no-flame methods whenever possible. Ready-to-eat food, soaked oats, peanut butter, canned goods eaten cold. For warmth, we layered clothing and used the reflective insulation intelligently, keeping our body heat within the chamber without creating obvious warm airflow out of the culvert. For scent control, we used carbon pads, sealed waste, and wiped down surfaces regularly. It felt obsessive, but in an invisible shelter, cleanliness isn't vanity. It's stealth. Then there was sound. The world above had become quieter overall, which meant any odd noise stood out more. So we padded everything. We wrapped tool handles in cloth. We put foam under the battery. We lined the base of the ladder where it met concrete to reduce vibration. Tanya looked at me one night, watching me tape foam to a corner. You were born for this, she said, but her tone wasn't admiration. It was sadness. Like she wished the world hadn't required this version of me. I was born for buildings, I said, not for this. But we did it anyway. A month in, the outside world felt like a different planet. We could tell by the radio. The official broadcasts became shorter, then disappeared. The ham operator's voice persisted longer than I expected, but even he grew intermittent, like his power situation was failing or his location was compromised. We learned to interpret the silence. A sudden absence of any voices on the band meant either widespread outages or widespread danger. Sometimes, late at night, We heard distant pops. Not constant, not close, not something I wanted to interpret too confidently. We never chased the sound. Chasing sound is how you become visible. Instead, we focused on sustaining our pocket. Water was the next major system. We had bottled water, but it wouldn't last forever. Our shelter was built around stormwater, but stormwater is not drinking water. So we built a quiet filtration plan. On one run, I scavenged a gravity-fed water filter system from an outdoor store. Ceramic element, activated carbon stage designed for camping groups. Not a perfect guarantee, but better than nothing. We used it with extreme caution. We collected water from a point upstream where the flow was fresher and less likely to be contaminated by surface runoff near roads. We let sediment settle in a bucket, then filtered slowly. Tanya was strict about this. She treated water like medication. Dosage and risk. Every shortcut costs you later, she said. I'd never argued with her on water. For food, we became strategic. We didn't just look for calories, we looked for quiet calories. Food that didn't require loud opening, loud cooking, or strong smell. We found canned tuna and learned to open it carefully with a wrapped can opener to reduce noise. We found plain rice and learned to soak it longer so it could be eaten without a full boil. We found multivitamins in a pharmacy back aisle and treated them like gold. And we avoided the obvious places. The obvious places were where other people went, and other people were unpredictable. We scavenged from the edges, small office kitchens, forgotten break rooms, maintenance cages, storage closets, places that held supplies but not crowds. The first time we encountered another living person close to our shelter, it happened because I broke my own rule. I went out on a clear, quiet afternoon when I should have waited for rain. I told myself it was fine. The highway noise was moderate, the woods were still. I needed a small but important item. Additional batteries for the radio and the detector. I found them in a small hardware store in a strip mall, the kind that had survived by being useful and local. The front windows were cracked but not destroyed. The lights inside were off. I slipped in through a side door that had been left ajar. Inside, the air smelled stale. The aisles were shadowed. I moved fast, grabbed batteries, grabbed a roll of weather stripping, useful for sealing small gaps, and turned to leave. That's when I heard a voice behind me. Don't move. I froze. Not because I was obedient, but because sudden movement could escalate everything. I raised my hands slowly. I'm not here for trouble, I said, keeping my voice calm. A man stepped into view from behind an aisle, mid-30s maybe, baseball cap, a backpack, something in his hands that he held like he'd practiced holding it. Not pointed directly at me, but ready. His eyes flicked over my tool bag strap, over my gloves, over my posture. You're alone? He asked. Yes, I lied immediately, because the truth would lead him to Tanya, and Tanya was not negotiable. He frowned, like he didn't believe me. Where are you staying? He asked. Moving, I said. Not staying. He studied my face like he was trying to decide if I was worth following. In that moment, I didn't think about bravery. I thought about systems. If I led him to my shelter, it was over. If I antagonized him, I risked a conflict I didn't want. So I did the safest thing. I made myself unprofitable. I don't have much, I said, and I let him see the contents of my hands. Batteries, weather stripping, boring things. Not food, not medicine. He glanced, disappointed. Trade? He asked. I don't have anything valuable, I said. He took a step closer. What's in the bag? Tools, I said. Fixing stuff. It's not food. His jaw clenched. Hunger does that to people. Turns logic into a thin thread. Then, from outside, a sound rose, distant shouting, a wave of noise. The man's head snapped toward the front of the store. His attention broke. His threat focus shifted. That tiny shift was my opening. Not to attack, but to leave. I backed toward the side door, slow, hands still visible. "I'm going," I said. "You should go too." He hesitated, torn between the potential gain of robbing me and the potential danger outside. Then he made his choice. He moved toward the front, toward the noise. I slipped out the side door, turned into the alley, and disappeared into the tree line with my heart hammering. When I got back to the culvert, Tanya saw my face and knew immediately. "You broke timing," she said, not accusing, just stating. "Yeah," I admitted. "Did anyone see you come back?" "I don't think so," I said, but "I don't think so" isn't a guarantee. So we adapted. We changed our travel routes, using different approaches to the culvert. We added additional camouflage at the entrance. We brushed out footprints. We were careful with disturbed vegetation. We even created decoys, small signs of human presence in unrelated places, like a piece of cloth tied on a branch a quarter-mile away, suggesting someone used that path regularly. Not enough to attract attention, just enough to confuse. Weeks became months. Fall arrived quietly. The air turned crisp. The humidity that had clung to the concrete eased slightly, but the cold started creeping in at night. Invisibility in winter becomes harder because survival needs heat, and heat becomes a signal. We didn't have the luxury of a fire. We didn't have the safety of a heater that vented exhaust. So we went deeper into low-signal living. Layered clothing, insulated sleeping platforms, reflective barriers, warm food eaten rarely and carefully. We found chemical hand warmers in a sporting goods aisle and used them like emergency medicine, only when our fingers became too stiff to work. Tanya kept us honest. "You can't freeze yourself to stay hidden," she said one night when she saw me refusing warmth out of stubbornness. "Dead people are very hidden. That's not the goal." That made me laugh, which made her smile, and the sound felt like sunlight. In those months, Tanya and I became something like a team. Not in a heroic sense, but in a practical one. Two people combining skill sets. I handled infrastructure, she handled bodies and minds. Together, we handled the hardest part of invisibility, staying human without being seen. We talked quietly about our old lives, but not too much. Too much nostalgia was a trap. It made you mourn instead of adapt. We also planned for long-term sustainability. We found a small cache of seeds in a garden center and debated whether it was worth trying to grow anything. Underground was no good for it, but there were hidden patches of land nearby that were out of view. The problem was time spent outside. Gardening is a pattern. Patterns get noticed. In the end, we planted only a few low-profile herbs in small containers near a concealed sunlight patch. Nothing obvious, nothing that looked like a garden. Just a small source of flavor and morale. Morale matters more than people admit. A person without morale makes mistakes. Mistakes create signals. The first winter storm tested our shelter the way the summer storm had, but worse. Heavy rain first, then freezing temperatures. The drainage flow surged. The water level in the lower channel rose close to our sandbag barrier. We stayed awake, packed to leave if necessary, watching the marks on the wall, listening to the roar. It didn't breach. When the storm eased, the world outside was silent in a new way, muffled by snow. Snow is a different kind of danger because it records your movement. Every footprint is a message. So we stayed inside for days, living on stored food, listening to radio static, conserving power. On the fourth day after the storm, when the sun came out and the snow began to crust, we heard voices above the hatch. More than one person. We killed light instantly. We didn't move. The voices were clearer than before, close enough that I could hear individual tones. Says there's food down here. No way. Look, there's a culvert. People hide in these. My muscles tensed. Someone had followed a rumor, or guessed, or simply gotten desperate enough to start checking places people hide. They walked directly over the hatch. I heard the scrape of the boots on metal, then a sharp rattle. They were testing the handle. Tanya's hand found mine in the dark. Her grip was tight, steady. Not fear, focus. The lock held. But locks can be broken. The voices argued. We don't have time. You want to freeze out here? Try the other side. There's got to be a way in. Footsteps moved away toward the slope, toward the culvert. Tanya's eyes met mine in the darkness. She didn't need to speak. We both understood what was happening. Our invisibility had been compromised, not by accident, but by the natural evolution of desperation. People check the margins when the center is gone. So we executed the contingency we'd hoped never to use. We grabbed the go-bags. We moved quickly but quietly. We shut down everything that could glow. We disconnected the inverter. We sealed waste. We took the radio. We left behind heavy items we couldn't carry. Deep cycle battery. Most food. The sleeping platform. My hands shook as I left those supplies behind, but Tanya's face was set in a hard calm. Stuff is replaceable, she mouthed. We climbed down into the lower channel just as we heard voices echoing from the culvert entrance. A faint beam of light flickered down the tunnel. We moved deeper, away from the entrance, into the darker part of the drainage line where the channel narrowed. This was the part I'd explored early on but never used. Too damp, too uncomfortable. But now it was our escape route. We crawled in the cold, shallow water, keeping to the side ledge. The sound of water covered some of our movement, but not all. Behind us, voices echoed. Hello? Anyone down there? We didn't answer. We kept moving. After about 200 feet, the drainage line split. One branch continuing toward the main outflow, another rising into a smaller maintenance passage. I'd found it weeks earlier during a cautious exploration. An old service conduit that led upward toward another access point. We took it. We climbed, hands numb, using corroded rungs. The air changed, less damp, more dusty. At the top, there was a grate, not a hatch, an opening disguised by debris and brush. I pushed it gently. It lifted, resisting, with frozen leaves. We slipped out into a thicket on the far side of the berm, away from the main culvert entrance. The cold air hit my face like a slap. We didn't run. Running makes noise. Running makes you visible. We moved fast but controlled. Keeping low, staying in tree cover, putting distance between us and our shelter. Behind us, faintly, I heard the sound of metal being struck, someone trying to force something. Then a shout. Then another. We didn't look back. We moved until the highway noise grew louder. Then we used it as cover, following a utility corridor that paralleled the road. By the time we stopped, we were in a place I'd marked mentally as a backup. An abandoned maintenance shed near a stormwater retention basin farther west. Half collapsed, mostly forgotten. It wasn't as good as our vault. It wasn't underground. It wasn't inherently invisible. but it was a temporary hide while we decided what came next. Inside the shed, we crouched in the dark, breath visible. Tanya looked at me, her face pale in the dim light. "They found it," she whispered. "Yeah," I said. "And we're still here," she replied, like she was reminding herself. I nodded. Then I did something I hadn't done in months. I allowed myself to feel grief, not for the supplies, not for the room, but for the idea that you could build something stable in an unstable world. We'd built an invisible shelter, and invisibility had worked until it didn't. Because nothing stays secret forever when enough people are forced to become searchers. That night, in the shed, we made the next plan. Not a single place. A moving invisibility. We would become the kind of presence you can't pin down. A patternless life. No smoke. No consistent scavenging route. No obvious base. We would use the world's forgotten spaces like stepping stones, storm drains, utility easements, abandoned service corridors, the backs of industrial parks, the voids between infrastructure where human attention rarely lingers. My skill set wasn't just building one hidden room. It was understanding how the built world connected. And Tanya's skill set wasn't just keeping people alive. It was keeping us from making the kinds of choices that felt necessary in the moment but destroyed you later. So we started again. We moved at dawn when fog hugged the low ground. We slept in places that were uncomfortable but unseen. We ate boring food quietly. We listened to radio fragments when we could. Sometimes we saw the infected at a distance, moving wrong, clustered around noise, drawn to motion. We avoided them without dramatics, like you avoid a dangerous intersection. Sometimes we saw other living people, some organized, some desperate, some quietly watchful. We avoided them too, unless we had reason to believe contact wouldn't become a chain around our necks. In late winter, we found a new hiding place that changed everything. Not a single chamber, but a network. Near an old rail line outside of Phoenixville, there was a maintenance tunnel system used for drainage under the tracks, multiple access points, multiple exits, a place where you could vanish in one direction and reappear in another. We explored it slowly over days, mapping it with a pencil and notebook, marking safe zones, marking water levels, marking exit routes. Then we did what we'd learned to do best. We made it invisible. We didn't leave obvious signs. We didn't build anything that looked like a camp. We didn't stockpile in one place. We created caches, small, sealed, hidden stores of supplies tucked into crevices, behind loose panels, under stacked stones, each one marked with a code only we understood. We created a rotation. We stayed in one node for 2 nights, then moved to another. We never stayed long enough to create a heat signature in one spot. We never created a pattern visible from above. We became, in effect, a whisper moving through concrete. And in that whisper, we found something like survival. One evening, months after we'd fled the original vault, Tanya sat beside me in the dim tunnel light, her back against concrete, her knees pulled up. She was thinner than before, so was I, but her eyes were steady again. "Do you ever think about going loud?" she asked quietly. "What do you mean?" "Joining a group, a community, one of those places with fences and rules and a gate." I thought about it. Groups had advantages. Food pooling, shared watch, shared skills. Groups also had one fatal weakness. They were visible. "I think about it," I admitted. "And then I think about what happens when a group gets noticed by the wrong people." She nodded, like she'd been turning that thought over too. I miss normal, she said. I miss forgetting, I replied. She looked at me, a tired smile flickering. You know what I miss? She said. What? Turning on a light without thinking it's a signal. I let out a soft laugh. Same. We sat in silence, listening to the faint vibration of a distant world that still moved in fragments. And in that moment, I understood something that had taken me months to accept. The shelter wasn't the concrete vault. It wasn't the tarp walls. It wasn't the battery or the filters. The shelter was the discipline of staying invisible without disappearing inside yourself. It was the choice to keep your signals low but your humanity intact. It was building a life that didn't announce itself to danger. And it was doing it with someone who could look at you in the dark and remind you that survival wasn't just breathing. It was staying yourself, quietly, in a world that had forgotten how. We never went back to the first shelter, not even to see what was left. Sometimes, on nights when the radio was pure static and the tunnels felt like the whole world, I imagined that chamber flooded or stripped or occupied by strangers who didn't know how close it had come to being a real home. But I didn't let myself mourn it too long. Because invisibility taught me the simplest rule of the new world. If you can leave without being seen, you can live. And if you can live without being seen, you can outlast the noise. So we kept moving. Quiet steps, dim light, sealed waste, controlled breath. Two ghosts traveling through the infrastructure of southeastern Pennsylvania, surviving not by winning fights or making speeches, but by building systems so small and so careful that the broken world never learned where to look. And every time we slipped through another unnoticed passage and felt the danger fade behind us, I reminded myself of the promise I'd made on the phone the day everything started stuttering. I was going to disappear. Not to give up. Not to vanish. But to stay alive long enough to see whether the world someday could learn how to breathe again.